A cosmological argument for the existence of God is an argument that infers the existence of God as the explanation for the existence of the cosmos. That's why it's called that, the cosmological argument. So the universe, if you like, the world as we know it, right, can be explained in virtue of thinking that God is its creator. That is characteristic of cosmological arguments. But there are different versions. And again, my colleague Bill gave two versions. One from contingency, the contingency of the universe, as he described, and the other briefly stated as an argument from the origin of the universe. And that's the one we're going to look at more fully now. Now, this argument is sometimes called the Kalam Cosmological Argument because it was developed during the medieval period among a group of Islamic scholars, Arabic scholars, who believed that God existed and thought about reasons to do so, and hammered out an argument along these lines. And this fit a tradition of natural theology in their religious context that we could say was called Kalam. And so Bill Craig, in fact, I think, is really responsible for bringing back into the discussion today this really ancient argument that has not been refuted, and to enjoy the benefits of it without drawing the same conclusions that a Muslim might about what God is like or has revealed. So that's just a bit of history. I won't go into any other details or talk about early critics of the argument, but there have been some from the beginning. But it is important to emphasize the pattern of the argument. And I should have gone up here to this. And because of the way the slides are designed, you're going to see on the screen each of the 4 points that subdivide this section of the outline. So there's the background to the argument that I've just sort of briefly surveyed for you. And then we'll consider this a statement of the argument in two forms. We'll look at a short version and then a long version. And then we'll look at a list of objections to the argument with an interest in answering those. And I'll say a few things about how we might use this argument ourselves with others. So what is the argument? Well, here we come now to the statement of the argument itself. And here's the short version. And it really is short. I've put it in bold print, right, on page 9. That's where we are, by the way, in this oddly designed outline. But you'll see that 4.1 is the short argument and 4.11 is the first premise. 4.12 is the second. So what is the first premise? What does it say? Yes, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's the first premise. Second premise, the universe began to exist. Can you say that for me? Good. Now, does anything follow from these two premises? Can you figure out what comes next? Don't look. Don't look down. Look up. Okay? Premise number 1, let's say it together. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise number 2, the universe began to exist. Therefore, now how did you know that? Because it follows necessarily from the premises. And I actually wrote it down there, 4.13. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That's the argument. You think you can remember that? You say, well, sure, but can I believe it? Well, let's think about it. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Well, what else is going to explain the beginning of the existence of anything? You know, given the evidence that we have for the coming to be of things with which we are familiar, there is really zero probability that there's something out there that came into existence without a cause. See, relative to the evidence we have, of the actual coming to be of things, which all have causes, we have zero probability that there's something that comes to be without a cause. Also, this is a basic principle of reasoning that I think we just intuitively know to be true. And certainly it would be odd for any of us to come across something that we could be sure did not have a cause. Usually what scientists do when they can't find the cause for something is they just keep looking. They don't say, oh, well, there's probably no cause for that. Maybe only with the origin of the universe will we do that. There's special reasons why people might do that, because they don't do that with anything else. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Should we believe that? Well, this is the crucial premise, and there are 4 lines of evidence for this, and they can be broken up into 2 parts: philosophical arguments and scientific evidence. Now, there is an argument, there are 2 arguments from the domain of philosophy that the universe began to exist. One is from the impossibility of an actually infinite collection of things. Now, I want to refer you to the excellent chapter 4 in this book that you received with your conference registration, chapter in Bill's book, On Guard, developing how this argument works. It's a fascinating argument. I want to focus on the second one, the argument from the impossibility of forming an infinite collection or series of things by successive addition. But I'm going to show you that when we come to the longer version, okay? So that's separate. But the basic idea here is that if the universe has always existed, in other words, if premise number 2 is false, it did not begin to exist, but has always existed, if that's true, then the series of events that makes up the history of the universe would have to be infinite. It'd be like an infinite collection of things. But if an infinite collection of things is impossible, well, then that can't be, and so the universe has to have a beginning. It has to be temporally finite. Alternatively, if it's impossible for you to go from a set that is finite, or a collection of things that's finite, and then somehow by adding one thing to the set or the collection after another, it's impossible for that set to ever become infinite. It'll always be finite even as it grows in its size. And so if that's the way the history of the universe comes to be as a collection of events, well, then it has to have a beginning. And when it comes to explaining the origin of the universe, many scientists will just say, well, that's not a scientific problem. But does that mean it's not a problem? Maybe it's not a scientific problem. Do you just say, well, no problem because it's not scientific? That's a kind of worry that some people raise. But we're going to say that there is scientific evidence because we're at least brought to the brink. The universe had a beginning. And the Big Bang cosmology is evidence for that because it's evidence that the universe exploded into existence in some fashion of an explosion a finite time ago. Maybe it was 13 billion years ago, maybe 20, maybe less than 13, and they try to figure out within some margin of error how long ago it was. And that's another interesting thing, is that they can't really get very precise in their measurements of these things. And they change, too. But the basic evidence that the universe exploded into existence is the same. So part of that evidence is the observation of something called the red shift in light that's emitted as you observe its behavior in space. And this allows scientists to extrapolate back in time to the source. And it has to have one. That's crucial, the red shift. Prior to this observation that was made, there were actual theoretical developments that led scientists to expect that the universe would have a beginning, and so they were looking for things that would confirm that, and then the red shift provided them with that evidence, but it would have anyway, without that expectation. There are other things, something called the cosmic background radiation is further scientific evidence of the same sort. Some have said that because, this is another point, that because galaxies move further away from our own at a faster rate, the further they are from ours. You can't really see this happening. I mean, it's not going to help to go out on your porch tonight and look for this. But because that happens, this is thought by some to be evidence as well. So many of us say, well, I guess we have to kind of take their word for it, right? Because this is complex. Yes and no. I think that to understand the physics of it, yes, it's very sophisticated, it's very subtle, and there are new developments on a regular basis, but there's a consensus that you can appeal to. And you don't have to be a cosmologist to bring out into the open this evidence as evidence that the universe had a beginning. Very seldom have I had to do that. Even with, from the most sophisticated people I've talked to those who, have a high school diploma and that's all. You just remind them that this is the accepted view. But if you want to learn more, as I hope you do, you can do no better than to begin your education again by reading the details in this chapter. It really is very good. And with that, maybe new questions about the details will lead you to more material. But for others of you, this will be enough. And for all of us, we can say, but look what scientists today are saying. Now, the second line of scientific evidence is that there are these fundamental laws of thermodynamics, all of which are interesting and salient here, but the second of which is the most sort of obviously significant. And that is the law that describes the increase in entropy, right, as the energy in the universe is diffused and in effect used up over time. Now, it'll take a long time because there's a lot of energy. But it's supposed to happen eventually because there's no infusion of new energy into the universe. And so it's like fuel being burned up. Eventually the universe will run out of gas in one way or another. Now, why is that evidence that the universe had a beginning? That sounds like evidence that's going to have an end. Well, it's because if it's going to end, then it must have had a beginning. Why? Couldn't something that never began cease to exist? Here's the problem. If something that's always existed and hence is made up of infinitely many events, let's say, is eventually going to have a last event and stop existing, why hasn't it happened yet? There's been plenty of time for it. You see the problem? See, we just need one more event before it happens, or whatever they can extrapolate into the future? Why has the universe waited so long to die if it's had an infinite amount of time in which to do it? You see the intuition here? That's the problem. So, what's the first premise? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. Now somebody's going to say, oh, wait a minute, I don't hear anything about God in this. Look at the next point, 4.14. The cause of the universe must have certain properties. Whatever properties are required to bring the universe into existence, right, out of nothing, by the way, using no raw materials. Because there's no space and time, like first or before this, that God can mess with and then get a universe. No, that's the point. Something comes from nothing. But it's not from nothing in the way that nothing could cause it, right? Nothing does that. And I mean, nothing does it in the sense that it doesn't do it, if you know what I mean. So what properties would this being have to have? Well, it's got to be non-temporal because it creates time. It's got to be non-spatial because there is no space apart from the production of the universe. The cause must be non-physical. Duh. the cause must exercise free choice. This is an interesting one because if the cause is non-temporal, non-physical, then there's got to be some explanation for the origin of the universe, right? Because otherwise we'd have a similar problem to the one we mentioned earlier, where it'd be like, well, why didn't it just already happen? But there's got to be a decision of a sort, a willing that this thing be. If the will was always there, well, then the universe would always be there, but it hasn't been. And if the will was never there, well, then it wouldn't happen. So there's a willing, and it's a free choice, a self-directedness of the agent responsible personally for making it happen. Also, the cause must have enough power and intelligence to create a universe using no raw materials. You might say, oh, well, okay, I didn't hear you say omnipotence there. I didn't hear you say omniscience there. Fine. But do you have any idea how much power would be required to bring a universe into existence out of nothing? Can you tell me what the limit is? You know, what you could get away with without omnipotence? Look, if a creator did that, and he said, by the way, I am omnipotent, I don't think I would disagree with him. And I think he's liable to be more intelligent about such things than I am. And apparently the cause acted for a reason, has a motive. Okay, so what? Well, next premise, any being that has these properties is entitled to be God, called God, therefore God exists. Now, is there more that we could say about God in an ideal conception of God? Of course there is, but you don't try to squeeze more out of an argument than is available to you in the resources of the argument. That's part of being intellectually honest. And so we say what we can, which is a lot, about why we should believe that God exists. And then we link it up with other evidences that will tell us even more about God. Now, what's the long form? I'm going to read these out to you, and then I'm going to explain just a bit of it. The physical universe exists. Second, the history of the universe is a series of events arrayed in temporal succession. That's kind of how they're ordered. There's a structure of a temporal sort among things that are constituents of our universe. Third, either this series includes infinitely many events arrayed in temporal succession, or it has always existed and has always existed, or it's a series of finitely many events and the universe had a beginning. Those are your options. Fourth premise, the series does not include infinitely many events arrayed in temporal succession. It doesn't. Fifth, the series of events arrayed in temporal succession, then, is finite and the universe had a beginning. Number 6, if the universe had a beginning, then the universe was caused to exist, or caused to begin to exist. Therefore, the universe was caused to exist. The cause of the beginning of the universe must transcend the physical universe and be non-temporal and have all these properties that we already spoke of. Therefore, number 9, naturalism is false, and some form of supernaturalism is true. Number 10, theism is the simplest version of supernaturalism that explains the origin of the universe. Therefore, God exists. You don't multiply things to explain something if something simpler will do the trick. That was referred to as Occam's razor in the little clip. Now, where is the meat of this argument? Premise 4. The series does not include infinitely many events arrayed in temporal succession. We have reason to think that. Why is that? Why think that this isn't the case? Well, there are interesting ways to describe this. The basic idea is that you could pick any event, whether it's an event now occurring or something in the past, or one that might happen in the future like we imagined with the death of the universe, and ask, if the universe never had a beginning, how many events would have to occur before that one that you picked could occur? And the answer would be infinitely many. So in a way, now we have the problem is that it would never occur because you can't complete a set like that. You can't produce movement towards a definite point when you've got to sort of, as it were, traverse infinitely many points first. That's a problem. Now I can illustrate this problem. Let's suppose, we won't do it in the interest of time, but let's suppose this auditorium was full of people. There were 1,000 people in this room, and we decided that everybody in the front row would stand up. And I would say, okay, take turns sitting down, starting here and going to there. And there's Brian sitting over there, and that really is Brian. And Brian sits down last, okay? But we have a finite number of entities that are taking turns sitting down. That's successive change, successive events, right? They're occurring in temporal succession. So that's our analogy with the way the universe and its history is arrayed. But now then we add the second row and we say, okay, now start over there in the second row, go all the way down. When you get there, come back on the loop, and then Brian sits down. It'll take longer if we keep the rate of change constant, but eventually he will sit down because the chain is finite. And we do this for the rest of the people in the auditorium, right? But the organizers of the conference ran into a little problem. The interest in this conference was so intense that there are infinitely many other people that want to be here. And they want to be in this room. And they want to play this game. They want to sit down with you. And so we invite them in, and here they come. Now I ask you, if we get infinitely many people involved in this little exercise, taking turns, right, sitting down, when will Brian eventually get to sit down? When will he sit down? Never. Poor Brian. But neither will any of you. Why? Because infinitely many will be ahead of you. And you can pick any one of them, and the same thing will be true of them too. That's pretty bizarre. So you can do it with a finite number, you can't do it with infinitely many. The universe is enough like that for us to have reason to believe that it had a beginning. Do you think you could use that argument? You think you could make that point? You don't have to be a philosopher. Use extension cords. Okay? Plug it in. Now, to get power from the outlet to your lamp, you got to have a cord. So you plug it into your lamp and you come over here and it won't reach. So what do? You go get another extension cord that's either longer or, probably more likely, you just add it to that one. And just hope, the fire marshal doesn't show up. Now, he's got a real issue on his hands if you've got to keep going further and further back into infinity to get your charge to light up the light. He's going to have problems with how many you've set up, to light your lamp, because that looks risky. But you can tell him, don't worry, there's no danger here because the outlet is infinitely receding. And I'm never going to be able to plug this thing in. Then he's going to want to know, how can somebody smart enough to figure that out bother trying, right? And people are like that when it comes to this argument. Now, there are any number of objections. Some of them are interesting, fascinating. Some of them are a little bit kind of scary at first, and then you think about them and it's not so bad. Others of them are, you have to mention them just because they get mentioned. So, for example, this is 5.2. I want you to skip to, let's see, which one? 5.24 on 11, page 11. Look at that one. What caused God? Now, that's the objection. It's actually a question, right? But in the question is the implication God needs a cause. And if God needs a cause, well, then off you go, looking for causes of things, back into infinity. And if God needs a cause, he can't be God either. Now, how do you respond to that? Well, you say, well, look, if I had made in my argument a crucial premise of the following sort, you might have a problem with this. And that would be if I said everything that exists has a cause. But I didn't say that, and I don't believe that. What I believe, and I think you should believe, is that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that's true of the universe. It's not true of whatever it is that can do that, and that's God. And yet, I get this question all the time. That's how easy it is to respond to that question. Show me, just invite the person to show you in the premises what commits you to the view that if God exists, he has to have a cause. They won't be able to do it. The objection is answered. Now, there are a lot of other interesting objections here to contemplate. I want you to pass an eye over these, and I want to have you turn to page 12. I'll come back to this in a moment. But on page 12 at the top, I want to give you a brief list of suggestions for using the argument. I mean, in addition to what we've talked about, there's some specific practical things to keep in mind. First of all, keep it simple. You say, well, wait a minute. Didn't you already sort of blow it? I mean, Mr. Philosopher. Well, listen, I'm justified in giving you more detail because you're getting equipped, right? And you want to be versatile and well-versed and have as much firepower at your disposal to make sense of these claims. But you don't always have to go out with all guns blazing. I shouldn't have said go out with all guns blazing. You don't always have to be loaded to the hilt with all the details of the argument. Start with simplicity. What is that? Premise number one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. You guys forgot. Premise number two. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Okay, what do we say about that? And you fill in the details. All right? That's keeping it simple. If that doesn't do the trick, then give them detail. Find out where they need it. And that's what the second point is. Move to greater subtlety and detail as needed, but not more than needed. And you know what? If you reach your limit and the person is still pressing you for more detail, then go get yourself educated about that. That's when you know it's time to get back into the study and work harder at this. But don't wait trying to master everything before you get into the field. See, there's homework that we do, and there's a certain minimal amount of homework that we must do. But we can't just do homework all the time. We've got to do field work. And it's when you do field work that you actually find out what sort of homework you need to do. All right? So keep that in mind. Set the stage for deploying other evidences in a cumulative case. Don't settle for just using this one argument, in other words, but build it into other things that you can say on behalf of God's existence. Fourth, master the key terms and concepts. Use these as ways of recalling more details, but learn the terminology and learn how to explain it to others. And then finally, understand the chief objections and proper responses. I hope that included in your homework, you will go through these questions for further study that I have left with you on page 12 and begin to read the recommended reading on page 13. But now, because we have time, I want to give you an opportunity to ask your questions, and I want to see if any of them parallel questions that I have listed for you under point number 5. Point number 5, really listed under point number 5.2. So we'll stop with that, my presentation, and see what you have to say in response. And all you have to do is get out of your seat and come up to one of these two microphones. It's waiting for you. And I'd like to see what your response is and whether there's one of these arguments and objections in particular that you would like to discuss. Thank you. He says we'll start over here.
Hi, I'm just going to state 52532.
Yes?
5231. The concept of an atemporal cause of a temporal series is incoherent. I have had that objection a lot, and one of the responses to that I've heard is that's why God has to be personal. He has to be able to freely act out of his inherent nature of eternity in order to spawn a temporal effect. Is that something you would...
You know, I didn't catch your statement of the argument because I'm behind the speakers, so that's why I've moved forward. And I didn't see it listed as 5.231. Is there a 5.231?
2531, sorry. This is
okay.
a horribly organized
So just tell me what
question.
that was again. I'm sorry.
The concept of an atemporal cause of a temporal series is incoherent. And the answer to that I've often heard is that's why God must be a personal being. He must freely choose to act outside of his inherent nature of eternity in order to spawn a temporal cause. My question is, doesn't that sound a lot like something popping into existence uncaused out of nothing? And if so, would Occam's razor just reduce that to the universe came into existence out of nothing?
Yeah. Okay, so the worry here is that you've got something temporal that comes to be, and purportedly comes to be as a result of an intentional act on the part of something that's atemporal. Now, how can something that's atemporal perform an act, right? And how can the result of that act be something that's temporal? One of the things always to ask when you get a question of this sort is to have the person spell out the details of the question. Give me an argument, in other words. Why is this a problem? You know? Tell me why it should be a problem for an atemporal being to produce a temporal universe. Now, some people think it's not just atemporality that's a problem here, it's also incorporality. That is, it has no physical body, right? And yet it brings into being physical things. But just to illustrate why that doesn't really seem like a serious issue to me is if I raise my arm, my view is that there's nothing physical that's doing that. It's a physical event that's brought about in a physical world by an immaterial thing. And that immaterial thing is my mind. So we actually are personally acquainted, intimately acquainted with things like that are really not that odd, except that we've talked ourselves into thinking that they're odd because we believe people who say, well, we have to be purely physical and nothing else. But the evidence is against that. So if the evidence is against that, even among finite creatures like ourselves, now we're not atemporal, but we have a non-physical substance bringing about a physical event. So that's evidence that that's possible because it is actual. Now, where is the soul? Where's the mind? Where does that exist? It's not physical, so it's not taking up space, right? So where is it? Well, it can't be anywhere because it's not physical. So it can't exist. Can't exist because it's not physical? Well, if it exists, it can't do anything, but it does do things. So you see, a simple way to go about it, though it can get very technical in other directions, is just to say, well, now look at a human act performed by a soul. Something that's not that's not physical, and so not locatable in the same way your body is in any kind of physical space. And yet it performs actions in a physical world. Now in this case with God, it's not an action in a physical world, it's the action of producing a physical world. But why should that make a difference? So I think that's kind of the short answer that could then expand into various directions, really depending on how your respondent wanted to go. One way they might go is say, well, I just don't believe that we have souls. And now you might actually be grateful that that's what you're talking about. Because that's even more significant, is what is the soul? And is there really such a thing? Let me go to the next one.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to ask you about 5.222. We talked about the idea that anything that has a beginning has a cause, or needs to have a cause, and that when we talk about God, God is necessarily existent, and so we don't need a cause for God. So I guess the question then that I would have is, well, then why can't the universe necessarily exist?
Okay, good. Well, the reason why it can't necessarily exist is that it hasn't always existed. You see, if it existed necessarily, well, then it would just exist eternally. That is, if it existed necessarily, it could not exist. But it did not exist. It does exist, but it did not. But if it's necessary, it could not exist.
Gotcha. And so that would be when we would go back to like the extension cord analogy or the evidences for it having a beginning point.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Now, somebody might say, well, how about if I retreat to this position and say, well, why can't it just, be that it's always existed? Maybe it's not necessary, but it's always existed. But, we gave arguments, evidence that that's not possible. So now anybody who wants to say that, why isn't that possible, is to say, well, now you have to answer my evidence. You don't have to just try to come up with new evidence on top of the evidence you already presented. They have to reckon with the evidence you gave them. So you say, well, no, wait a minute. If you think that's possible, explain that to me. Or if you think that's reasonable, show me why. I'm open to that, but I need to see evidence. I've given you evidence for the other side. You apparently don't accept that, but it's not enough just to reject my evidence without offering another explanation for it. Alternatively, someone might say, well, maybe it just popped into existence willy-nilly out of nothing. One of my Oxford-trained university professors at the PhD level said that in class in a course on the metaphysics of causality. One day he said to us, as we got to the end of the course, where you're running out of things to explain and ways to explain them, evidently the universe just popped into existence out of nothing. And that was the end of the course. So you say, well, now is that really a possibility? Some might say, well, it's a logical possibility, but that's uninteresting. We want to know if it's really physically possible because it's physical that happened. What happened is physical. And it has no explanatory power, really, because you're talking about nothing. Now, how does nothing even function in a hypothesis? It's not much of a hypothesis. Right? Anyway, some thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to ask you this, and I don't mean it as a trick question or a joke.
Okay.
I want to know the answer to this question.
Okay.
What was God doing before he created the universe, one, and where did he get the raw materials to make it?
Okay.
I mean, at ground zero of the Big Bang, there must have been a massive amount of energy and matter.
Yeah.
And where did it come from?
Well, God wasn't doing anything before the universe was created. You know what I mean by that?
No, I don't.
There was no
I'd
before.
like to know what you think about this.
Because there was no before. See, for there to be a before the universe was created, in any temporal sense of before, right, you can't have the beginning of time with the creation of the universe. There would have to be some temporal series first. So you see, God exists in a timeless now. The way we put it is sans creation. So we resort to Latin to speak of this notion that absence any actual universe where God does still exist or does exist, his existence doesn't involve doing things that take time, deliberation, or what have you. He wasn't playing cards. Right? He didn't create the universe out of boredom.
It is a good way to pass the time, but
there was no time. There was no time to pass. See, that's the issue. We have to pass time. God didn't have to pass time. He created time. Now, the other question was, how does he do that without raw materials?
Where did that stuff come from?
Yeah. Well, you and I can't do it. That's one thing we just should know better than to even try. Right? Because how are you going to do it? What are you going to use, right? But we're just not up to the job, and that includes not really knowing how it's done. And there are a lot of things that we know to be true without knowing how it works. Right?
Yeah.
Lots of things like that.
Lots of things.
So you walked up to a microphone expecting that your voice would be amplified, but a lot of people in here would say, how does that work? They have no doubt that it works until it doesn't. which happens all the time to me. All right? But my point is just that when you have evidence that something is the case, your inability to explain how doesn't provide you with evidence that it's not the case.
Well, I mean,
It just means that you've reached the limit of your understanding up to that point, which might be the limit of the understanding any of us could ever be capable of. And that's just a very important point for all of us to be aware of. You see, it would be another thing if you said, instead of asking me the question, in the spirit of goodwill that you did, if you said, now listen, there is no way that kind of being could have produced a universe with no raw materials. Well, then the burden of proof would be on you, wouldn't it? So why think that? So I don't have to answer the question I don't have to answer an argument that wasn't given to me.
I'm not trying to argue with it.
Exactly.
I'm just asking a question.
Exactly. But somebody else might say, hey, go up there and tell them that it's not possible. And it can't be done. Well, that can't be done. You can't show that it's not possible. But you can certainly wonder how. And I'm right there with you. And you know what? It's also possible that God couldn't explain it to us, in the sense that we'd actually understand it if he told us. That's possible.
All right, my question might be similar to his, but I mean, it might seem that way, but
yeah.
Maybe you'll understand the way I'm asking.
Okay.
If God did in fact create space and time,
yes.
How is it possible for God to think and act outside of time when time, it seems to us, is required for thinking and acting? And if God can in fact think and act outside of time, wouldn't that be a sort of God is special pleading?
Special pleading?
Yes. Right, where you cite something that he is an exception to a law or something,
well,
without giving
he has to be an
for
exception.
that.
I mean, this is not special pleading if there's reason to think that he's exceptional.
Right.
And he exists in an atemporally and non-spatially. So that's exceptional. So we can't conceptualize acting, we can't project onto God the way we think about acting on our intentions in time. That just is not going to work. So however it works, it can't be that. Right? So how is it going to work? We've come to another question of this sort, but it's not through God grinding out, sort of thinking about, what do I feel like doing? Well, maybe let's wait till tomorrow. There is no tomorrow. There's no passage of time with God. And somehow God can will the existence of something, and yet that thing not exist for an infinite amount of time while he's eternal. And I think it's a little bit helpful to see that if the universe existed for an infinite amount of time because God willed it and he was eternal, that wouldn't make the universe eternal in the way that God is. Because the universe would still be temporal and God is eternal, meaning non-temporal. You see what I'm saying there? So it's not like, well, you solve the problem by just saying, well, because he has this will and it just is what it is and there's no temporal quality to it, then there just should be a universe as long as he wills it. As long as, using that as a metaphor. Okay, well that would then, we think, mean it's always existed. But it would always exist as temporal, which God isn't. So how do you make sense of that? So what we've done here is we've kind of worked back and figured out what kinds of answers are not available to us. But we haven't found a good reason to think that's not a possibility, that an eternal God can have this will, this intention, but what comes about as a consequence of that willing is something that has not always existed. Now, I've just described what happens, but I haven't explained it, and I don't think I can.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. They're going to tell me to stop here in a minute.
You mentioned earlier in your speech that God can't provide overwhelming evidence or for His existence, or it would force worship. Since we're not all currently forced to worship, are you then implicitly saying that we don't have sufficient evidence for God? And how do you square that position with the idea that Satan has direct experience with God and is still able to rebel?
Look, that's a great question. The question was about whether I think that there is sufficient evidence for the existence of God, independent of the evidence God Himself could produce. When it sounds like I think that there isn't, because that would seem coercive. But you see, sufficient evidence to justify a belief is not, as such, coercive. Many of us, maybe all of us, have had times when we believe something that we shouldn't, given the evidence we have. Right? Or we believe something on the evidence that we do have, and we think that's the reasonable thing to believe, but we also think that if we didn't want to, we wouldn't have to believe it. So evidence isn't essentially coercive, and even really, really good evidence isn't essentially coercive. But there is evidence, many people think, that God might give that would coerce them, as if they want that. But their actual dispositions towards God belie their claim to want that. They don't want that. If they wanted that, they would get it in the form of the evidence that only God can provide. So, yes, I think there is ample and sufficient, adequate evidence to fully justify the belief that God exists, and this is an example of the kind of evidence that I believe. I wouldn't have rehearsed all that evidence if I didn't believe that. But notice, this is evidence that a proposition is true. We still need to see what its implications are as an appeal to our inner selves. And a lot of people are able to come to the conclusion that God exists on the basis of evidence of this sort, and just sort of set the other questions aside, because that's all that they were really thinking about anyway. And so sooner or later, you have got to reckon with God directly, relationally, no matter what the evidence is. But when you do, new evidence comes into play. That's my view.
Well, so what about the question about Satan, though?
So he's justified in believing that God exists, just like you and I are.
But he's not forced to worship?
Well, he's supposed to, but he doesn't.
But you said forced. I mean, that was the word.
I don't think he was forced.
But we would be forced if we had perfect knowledge of God's existence?
I'm saying that God's not going to produce for us the kind of evidence that would coerce us to believe that God exists. Because His interest is in wooing us into relationship. And that's going to include evidence that I believe is conclusive evidence, but it's provided on the condition that that's what you want.
So, but if God were to convince me, are you
Yes.
saying that I would still have the decision to
Yes.
not worship Him?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So why doesn't He convince
See,
us?
the way Paul puts it, the Apostle Paul puts it in Romans 1, is he says what we do is we suppress the truth. See, if you don't want to believe something for which there's good reason, you try to find good reason to think that the good reasons aren't good.
But
And
why wouldn't He just convince us? I mean, He's God, He can do anything. Why wouldn't He just...
The reason why I said that He wouldn't do that is because of His nature as worthy of worship, which requires a free response on our part to His loving kindness.
But Satan can rebel with perfect knowledge. That means
He doesn't have perfect knowledge. But he does.
Well, he has
look,
perfect knowledge that God exists.
that's right. Look, there are people who believe that God exists and they rebel against God. See, you don't have to be an atheist to resist God or to ignore God. You can believe in God, but just say, hey, you stay where you are, I'm going this way. Right? And I think that's what Satan's doing. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're out of time. I'd be happy to talk to you sometime else during the conference. Your questions have been great. I'm sure the others would be wonderful too, but we're out of time. Thank you.